The other day I did a video warning that de-dollarization could be coming. Today we got news that France cut a deal to buy 65,000 tons of natural gas from China denominated in yuan. This is a big deal. 6 weeks ago it was just pariah nations like Iran or Russia trying to de-dollarize their trade. Last week it was Brazil, now it's France. So what happens next? What if the US dollar is about to be dethroned as the world's reserve currency? De-dollarization means foreigners don't need as many dollars. This means there are extra dollars nobody wants. This makes the price of the dollar fall. It gets weaker. That's usually slow at first, and then it picks up speed if it keeps going, a progressive rush for the exits. Note, we Americans are obligated to use the US dollar thanks to an obscure law passed in 1862 as a wartime emergency that somehow managed to survive for 151 years now. So Americans have no choice. Unless you have gold or Bitcoin, you go down with that ship. Now, a falling dollar drives up the price of everything that comes into America, but it also drives up the price of anything traded on world markets. So that's the raw materials, the imported components that drive American factories and sustain American consumers. First to jump would be gasoline, heating fuel, food prices. All of these are world markets. They're very liquid. Along with prescription drugs, since China has a creeping stranglehold thanks to our idiotic overregulation. Indeed, this is more or less true for every consumer product that China dominates. We shot ourselves in the foot. Now it's coming back to bite us. Next, those jumps in trading commodities and input prices pour out through the supply chains. They yank up prices in industry after industry. So cars, construction materials like steel or concrete, clothes, furniture, TVs, computers, medical devices. Gone are the days of affordable luxuries. Now you got to work for it. And that's when the main event begins, capital flows. If foreigners get nervous, they sell not only dollars, they sell assets denominated in dollars. Starting with the most liquid, stocks, bonds, treasuries. These are very easy to trade. IBM stock takes you about a minute to trade compared to a Taiwanese factory in Wisconsin. So the liquid assets go first. Now, about 40% of American stocks are owned by foreigners and 1/3 of corporate bonds. If foreigners start fleeing, both plunge. This could cut your 401k almost in half. It could drive up borrowing costs for companies to impossible levels. That would lead to mass bankruptcies on top of the wave of bankruptcies the Fed is already engineering to try and stop the inflation it started. It doesn't stop there. 1/3 of US treasuries are owned by foreigners. That's over $8 trillion in bonds. If foreigners start dumping those, it will either send US government debt service soaring by potentially hundreds of billions of dollars a year. That all has to be deficit funded. Or, much more likely, the Fed simply steps in and replaces all of that foreign demand, which would flip inflation overnight back to the march into double digits. Losing reserve currency status would savage the American economy. It would savage the American people. No country needs reserve currency status. After all, it doesn't benefit the people. But like climbing a cliffside with no gear, once you go halfway, you better not let go. All right, we'll be watching this. See you next time.
The US to fear BRICS and their new currency. BRICS could develop their own reserve currency to compete with the US dollar. This could lead to the dumping of US dollars globally, causing an inflation tsunami to the US. The weaponization of the US dollar forced nations to look for an alternative solution, especially during the sanctioning of Russia from the SWIFT payment system. Moreover, Saudi Arabia stated it is open to accepting other currencies when trading oil, a potential catalyst for.
You must have heard about the petrodollar. It's a combination of two words, petroleum and dollars. Global oil trade takes place using the US dollar. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency, as well as a global benchmark of sorts. That's why forex reserves of most countries are maintained in US dollars. Since the dollar is the world's reserve and benchmark currency, crude oil transactions are done using it. That gives the United States a lot of power over global trade and financial transactions. Countries now increasingly view the USA's dollar hegemony as a threat. Washington can weaponize this hegemony to hurt any country, like it did when it froze hundreds of billions of dollars held by Russia as reserves in the US. So, what is the world doing about the petrodollar system? How do countries intend to end the domination of the dollar? And should the US be worried? Hello and welcome. This is Sanveer Singh Ranhotra and you're watching First Post. Let's tackle the last question first. Yes, the US needs to be very worried. The petrodollar system has not been challenged in decades. Before we get to that, how did the US dollar become so powerful in the first place? Saudi Arabia has traded its oil exclusively using the US dollar since 1974. That was the year Riyadh signed a deal with the United States to use only the dollar for oil trade in exchange for solid security guarantees. This marks the birth of the petrodollar. This further strengthened the dollar's status as a reserve currency. Today, the dollar's tight grip on global trade and its status as the world's reserve currency is being viewed with increasing suspicion by a host of countries. This has led to talk of de-dollarization. This is not just a dangerous concept, but a dangerous idea for any political leader to have. The United States has gone to war to protect its dollar hegemony all the way from the Gulf War in the 1990s, the brutal ouster of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, the absolute obliteration of Gaddafi in Libya, to the 8-year-long war with the Assad regime in Syria. All these regimes had one thing in common. They dared to challenge the USA's petrodollar hegemony and paid a heavy price for it. But this time, the challenge the US faces is not from some Arab nation. The challenge is coming from the second largest economy in the world, China. China's ambitions go beyond just being the most dominant economy. It wants to replace the United States as the leader of a new world order. You see, last week was something straight out of USA's worst nightmares. China's Xi flew into Riyadh in a pompous state visit intended to boost Beijing's ties with West Asian countries. Things got interesting when Xi Jinping told Gulf Arab leaders on Friday that China would work to buy oil and gas using the Chinese yuan. The Chinese president also said that his country will, and I quote, make full use of the Shanghai Petroleum and National Gas Exchange as a platform to carry out yuan settlement of oil and gas trade. China will continue to import a large amount of crude oil from the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, expand imports of liquefied natural gas, strengthen the engineering services in oil and gas upstream development, and the cooperation in storage, transportation, and refining. China is Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner, with bilateral trade worth $87.3 billion in 2021. In fact, it's the world's largest importer of crude, and most of its supplies come from Saudi Arabia. China purchases around 18% of all its oil from Saudi Arabia. In the first 10 months of this year itself, China bought oil worth $55.52 billion from Saudi Arabia. That's a large volume. Imagine that transaction not being done using dollars. The yuan being used for oil trade between China and Saudi Arabia will greatly short the Chinese currency's value and stature as not just a national currency, but one which can be used to settle trade globally. Meanwhile, Russia and China have been increasing the use of domestic currencies in mutual settlements of trade transactions. Many Russian firms, mainly dealing in energy, have begun issuing yuan-denominated bonds, and several banks are offering deposits in the Chinese currency. India has also taken steps to work out a rupee-ruble trade mechanism for its energy purchases from Russia, which has emerged as India's top oil supplier. When seen together, these are all steps that countries are taking to decouple from the USA's greenback currency. Do you think de-dollarization will be achieved anytime soon? Let us know in the comments.
It's happening way faster.
We need to do something about it. So the more US use the dollar as a weapon, the more the countries in the global south are realizing, guys, we need to do something about it. So there is discussions going on. And even in South America, little people know, but we already have a mechanism there. Not so used still, but we have a mechanism. It's Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay and Paraguay. We can do trade among these four countries without using the dollar. So this discussion is all around. And you know what? There's a funny thing about the currencies of the BRICS, because all of them start with R. It's renminbi from China, rubles from Russia, rupees from India, reais from Brazil, and rands from South Africa. So it's the five R.
Right.
Yeah.
I never thought about it. Yes.
Yeah, and it's the five R's against the five I's.
It's happening way faster than I expected. I thought we still had a lot longer to go, but just reading the comments, it seems as though the general consensus is this is happening at a very, very fast rate, with the US dollar actually losing steam, with the BRICS currencies as well building up. So this is why I say just watch these videos, stay ahead of the game, and just plan accordingly. If you see me doing something, that might give you an indication of what to do yourself. If you see in the private community what I'm doing with my money and my investments, that might, again, not financial advice, that might give you a little bit of an indication that you may want to diversify a little bit as well. But the reason I was mentioning yesterday's video is because we've just had an announcement that France has done a deal with China with LNG. This is liquid natural gas. And what did they do it in? Was it US dollars? Nope. They bypassed the US dollar and they did the deal in yuan. Yes, that has just happened. That is another blow for the US and the US dollar. And that's what yesterday's video was about. It was just showing the speed right now that the US dollar is losing global trade. It's happening at a rapid rate. Way faster, I'll be honest.
Directly or indirectly, having your currency as the world's currency conferred all kinds of gains for the United States economy. It meant, for example, that we could pull in the produce of the world, the French wine, the Japanese automobile, the technologies produced in Scandinavia or China, and so on and so on. And in exchange, we gave them dollars, little green pieces of paper, which mostly they turned around and lent back to the United States government so that they would make interest on their holdings of dollars. This was wonderful for the United States government, allowing the United States government to borrow more money than any country in the world. We are the world's largest debtor, partly because the dollar plays that role. It would be harder for the United States government to borrow if it weren't for the role of the dollar in the world. The ability of the United States to weaponize the dollar's role, to sanction countries, Cuba, Iran, Russia, everyone involved now in the Ukraine war on the Russian side, directly or indirectly, gave the United States enormous power in the world. The de-dollarization is taking all that away. And that is going to mean short-term pain in the United States. You're not going to be able to wield power the way you once did. The American empire, of which the dollar's globalization was a key part, is therefore weakening, as we have seen in many other dimensions of our situation. So in the short run, it'll pinch. It won't fundamentally threaten the United States. People who suggest that are alarmists and are taking this as happening both faster and further than it's likely to be. The rest of the world still needs the United States. The rest of the world still trades and depends in many ways on the United States. We are a colossus as a society and an economy in the larger world, but a one that is shrinking, and that's going to take away part of our power as a nation and part of our economic well-being as a nation. It really should surprise no one, because the position at the end of World War II, when the dollar really took on its global role, was that the rest of the world was wrecked. All potential competitors of the United States were gone, and so the dollar played a role it couldn't continually have. 75 years, a long time, and it's not surprising that now others want to participate in that power. Others want to participate in the economic benefits of having a global currency. In the longer run, the effect of all of this, I think, is the key issue here. Not the temporary, relatively small pinching that the decline of the dollar will affect on us. Here's the big question. What comes next, and how is the United States as a nation going to react to having its power and its wealth in difficulty, shrinking? One reaction is the one that we're mostly seeing: anger, upset, a war in Ukraine. They are all part of this. Sanctioning 40 countries around the world. Don't let them use the dollar the way they used to. Pinching their economies. Punishing them. Crystal clear. War noises around Taiwan and against China. That's one way. Trying to hold on. Trying not to let go. That's one response to the decline of the United States empire, exemplified by the de-dollarization. But there's an alternative scenario, an alternative way to see all this. And here's how that goes. The United States recognizes history. Every other empire that arose declined. The American empire arose across the 20th century, and it's begun to decline in the 21st. And the best way to handle that is to work out a livable arrangement. The most powerful competitor of the United States today, everyone knows, is the People's Republic of China. They are championing an alternative global currency. By the way, not so much their own, but a global composite, a multipolar alternative. Perhaps a currency based on the Chinese yuan, the Russian ruble, the Indian rupee, and other major players' currencies in some basket, in some grouping. Or maybe a whole new currency that everybody subscribes to who's interested. And you know, the world already has had more than the dollar. The euro has played a role, not as important as the dollar, but not unimportant either. So this new currency that the Chinese seem to be working on with their BRICS partners, Brazil, India, and so on, might be a third one alongside the euro and the dollar. That would be a kind of collective way of handling these issues that would recognize the legitimate desires of other countries to get in on this, would recognize the importance of the United States, even though that is relatively declining. I hope we go in that direction, because the alternative, trying to hold on against the role of history, is a foredoomed problem, a foredoomed project, and in a world of nuclear weapons, a very dangerous one as well.
More and more countries around the world are seeking alternatives to the US dollar, in particular because Washington has weaponized its currency and used the dollar to serve its geopolitical interests. In the 2 decades from 2000 to 2020, the US dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves gradually declined from over 70% to just under 60%. And in the past few years, especially with Western sanctions on Russia and China, and the war in Ukraine, and growing geopolitical tensions, this process of de-dollarization has significantly expanded. And what we've seen in China is a significant de-dollarization of its foreign exchange reserves in the past decade. In 2014, the People's Bank of China, that is China's central bank, saw its peak level of U.S. Treasury securities. Those are U.S. government bonds, that is debt, it's U.S. government IOUs. And since 2014, China's central bank has been gradually dropping its holdings of U.S. Treasury securities, and as of 2024, they are now under 800 billion, falling from a peak of about 1.3 trillion a decade ago. Now, for the most part, the People's Bank of China has not been selling many of its U.S. Treasury securities. Instead, it's been letting them mature because they have a certain maturity date. You know, usually 10 years is pretty common. So after they mature, China instead uses the dollars that it receives from that bond in order to invest in gold, in oil, in metals, in other assets. China has been lending its dollars abroad. And Bloomberg reported this April that the People's Bank of China bought gold for 17 months in a row a very mainstream economist has been reporting on China's de-dollarization of its foreign exchange reserves. His name is Robin Brooks, and as he wrote, China is trying to decouple financially from the U.S., and he notes that in the past, China invested a lot of its dollars in U.S. treasuries. Now it's building inventories in oil and base metal imports. This is financial decoupling. And he has a useful chart, and you can see that in the past few years, especially with growing geopolitical tensions, the war in Ukraine, China has been investing a lot in buying more and more oil, gold, and other metals. Robin Brooks created another useful chart, and it shows that China's imports of basic metals have increased by 60% since before the pandemic. And he notes that China doesn't want to put the dollars it earns into treasuries because that will only deepen its dependence on the U.S. So China builds inventories in dollar-denominated commodities, important commodities that it needs to run its manufacturing sector. And China, of course, is the world's leading manufacturing producer, responsible for about 35% of gross manufacturing output in the entire world.
We're putting an announcement this week that Russia will begin using the Chinese yuan for international payments instead of the dollar. Saudi Arabia is also in talks with Beijing to do the same thing. Speaking of Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, they're in talks with Iran as well to consider an economic alliance with China and Russia. And they can even be joining the BRIC countries, which is an acronym for these countries here: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries all have emerging economies. So what happens if our economy and the U.S. dollar are no longer the world's dominant currency? Former Assistant Treasury Secretary and host of the Monica Crowley podcast, Monica Crowley, is here to weigh in. Monica, great to see you this morning. Let's start right there. What happens if these emerging economies move away from the U.S. dollar towards the Chinese yuan?
Well, good morning, Will. It's great to be with you. And it's really hard to overstate exactly how catastrophic the abandonment of the U.S. dollar would be as the world's global reserve currency. Look, since the end of World War II, the dollar has been the safe place to go, and it's been backed up by a couple of things. It originally was backed up by gold, but President Nixon took us off the gold standard, so there's no hard asset backing up the dollar anymore for the last 50 years. But also it's been backed up by the strength and economic power of the United States and the fact that oil has always been traded in dollars. If that were to end, that would mean the end of the U.S. dollar. Look,
let's talk about BRICS. It's gearing up to challenge a West-led world order, and India is at the forefront.
U.S. dollar in their trade transactions. China and Brazil have agreed to abandon the U.S. dollar in their trade transactions and use their own currencies, the yuan and the real, instead. The deal, announced after a high-level China-Brazil business forum in Beijing, is expected to reduce costs and promote greater bilateral trade and investment. China is Brazil's largest trading partner, accounting for over a fifth of all imports and more than a third of all exports. The move comes after a period of rocky relations between Brazil and China under former President Jair Bolsonaro, who used anti-China rhetoric on campaign trail and in office.
Stop using the dollar to curb Western dominance. That's the message from a top Iranian official as he welcomed a Russian delegation to Tehran on Sunday.
The path initiated to reduce the influence of the dollar in regional and international transactions, which many countries are joining, will minimize Western dominance over the world economy.
Tehran's call comes as Russia and Iran agree to expand economic cooperation and increase payments in their national currencies, the ruble and rial. Moscow added it will invest in Iran's steel and oil production as well as improve direct banking relations. Tehran underlined the north-south trade corridor is a key part of its development too. Now that plan will link routes for goods from Moscow to India through Iran, bypassing Western nations and their sanctions. And comes as
On Monday, Iran announced it will host an event to discuss international monetary relations, and again, that term recently we're hearing so much about, de-dollarization. The country's central bank claims Tehran has already achieved significant progress in sidelining the greenback in bilateral trade with partner states. Iran and Russia aren't the only nations pushing for de-dollarization. Turkey's central bank recently announced steps to move away from the greenback and push domestic lenders to increase the reserves of the national lira currency. China and Malaysia, meanwhile, are weighing a potential Asian monetary fund as a counterbalance to the dollar-dominated international monetary fund. And in a move with potentially enormous geopolitical economic consequences, Saudi Arabia said in January it's open to discussing oil trade in currencies other than the greenback. So why is this all happening? Well, the Secretary General of the Asian MERS Forum, a cooperation grouping between major global cities, listed 3 major reasons behind the devaluation of the dollar over the past 30 years.
First, the financial crisis that occurred in 2008, and it was a deep one which affected many countries, especially Europeans, and all the countries who were in one way or the other connected with the dollar system. The other one was the cryptocurrencies, which was out of the hands of the Americans and again out of the dollar system. And the third one, which I could consider that as the most important one, is the overuse of the United States from the weaponization of dollar and putting sanctions on this country and that country over and over again. And it actually, let's say, we can say, helped the countries, the sanctioned countries, to go toward working together. So Iran was sanctioned, Russia was sanctioned, Venezuela was sanctioned, and China was sanctioned, and many, many other countries. And these countries realized that they could work with each other despite the sanctions, and there would be no further sanctions to be imposed on them. And they don't need actually the US dollar to work with each other so that it could be sanctioned or it could be limited by or controlled by the United States.
The U.S. Justice Department transfers approximately $500,000 in forfeited Russian funds to Estonia for benefit of Ukraine. As ever, Washington fails to grasp the optics in doing this. The Global South sees this as a further example of the rules-based order, where the U.S. in this case steals assets belonging to another nation. This will be another nail in the coffin lid of the dollar as nations look to implement measures to avoid dollar exposure and its weaponization. Washington continues to sow the seeds of its own rapid destruction due to its crass stupidity, arrogance, and ignorance. The U.S. weaponizes the dollar in the Russian and Iran sanctions. There is increasing desire by other developing countries to seek alternative currencies for trade, investment, and reserves, as well as developing alternative multilateral clearance systems outside of SWIFT. This is the end of the U.S. dollar dominance and its use as a weapon in the rules-based order. The Western Empire's collapse is in motion.
Доля стран объединения, в которых проживает более 3 миллиардов человек, достигла в мировом ВВП почти 26%. А по паритету покупательной способности пятерка обходит группу 7. Прогноз на 2023 год 31,5% против 35%. Набирает силу объективный, необратимый процесс дедоларизации наших хозяйственных сфер. Предпринимаются усилия по отработке эффективных механизмов взаимных расчетов и валютно-финансового контроля. Как результат, доля доллара в экспортно-импортных операциях в рамках БРИКС снижается. В прошлом году она составила всего лишь 28,7%.
The other day I did a video warning that de-dollarization could be coming.
Hey, hello friends, we come to the end already. Have you subscribed yet? Yes, press the subscribe button and the like button and the share button. Thank you and have a nice day.